Imagine being told your granddad's cabin, the place he built with his own two hands, belongs to the HOA now. What would you do if a clipboard queen marched into your living room like she owned the deed to your soul? Picture this. Neighbor. I'm standing in my own kitchen. A chipped blue mug warming my palms. Shaking hands with Michigan's Attorney General. We're talking about patterns. About paper trails. About how some HOA boards, well, there's people who turn power into a hobby and neighbors into prey. And then my front door doesn't knock. It cracks. It bursts like a bad magic trick. And in storms, Karen Wickshire, with a clipboard clamped so hard, her knuckles go bone white. She's shouting about immediate compliance before she's even looked up. Then she does look up, sees the state seal on a leather portfolio, freezes mid-tirade like a sprinkler that just hit winter. The Attorney General doesn't blink. Calm as sunrise. He says, "Ma'am, you just committed trespass and more. In front of the chief law enforcement officer of this state. You will wait outside." Karen's lips tremble. The clipboard wobbles like it knows the jig is up. And right then, I knew justice wasn't just coming, it was already sitting at my kitchen table, stirring sugar into black coffee. So, how'd a quiet guy like me wind up in a showdown with a petty tyrant? My name's Rex Holloway. A few years back, after my divorce, I moved north to Lakeshore Pines, tall pines, deep water. Summers that taste like sweet corn and engine oil. I inherited my grandfather's cabin, 2.3 acres of woods and water that smell like cedar, Old Spice, and sawdust. You ever run your fingertips along hand-hewn rails and feel the stories come up under the skin? That was the place. A dock my granddad laid plank by plank after Korea. Christmases in a living room that creaked the way old houses sing. Cousins' laughter stuck between the logs, like sap. I came up here for quiet. Instead, I got Karen. She's the human version of a paper cut small. Sharp. And always the afternoon, you forget the Band-Aid. Late 50s. Ironed khakis. Pearls that feel like a threat. And a silver SUV whose bumper shouts HOA official in blocky letters that nobody ever asked for. She measures lawns the way surgeons measure incisions. Planner tucked to her ribs like scripture. She swept into power, promising property values and community standards. And, what we got was a woman who chased bird feeders like they were contraband. A Vietnam vet's flagpole, 3 inches too tall. Sir. A widow's wind chimes, noise pollution. A chalk hopscotch graffiti. Apparently. But she had a special itch for my place. Because my cabin sits on the best slice of lakefront. Built long before her HOA ever existed. The first time she marched up my path, she smiled with all the warmth of a sticker burr and handed me a so-called courtesy notice, 47 violations. 47. My dock, allegedly 3 feet over the line. My fire ring, an unpermitted combustion structure. There were fees, $500 up front, then $75 a day until I comply. When I told her the cabin predated the HOA by decades, she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and said, "Previous construction is irrelevant. Mr. Holloway, all properties within HOA jurisdiction must comply. You have 30 days or we file a lien." She said lien like it was a flavor of gum. That night, I drove to the county building and started to dig. I brought a thermos and patience. I opened file drawers that smelled like dust and old tape. I read deeds in the pale light of a buzzing fluorescent tube while the janitor whistled Motown down the hall. After a few hours, The paper began to talk. The HOA's formation paperwork, filed months after my grandfather passed, had his signature scrawled on it like a ghost. Only it wasn't his handwriting. The developer's son, who just happened to be on the current board, showed up on every third page like a bad penny. And the dates? The dates were wrong in the way a liar's left eye twitches. Proving a lie is slow work. It takes more than a hunch and a headache. I needed evidence, a plan, and a patience that could outwait January. I went home and installed cameras front porch, backlot, out by the dock. One pointed at the driveway, where the pines lean in like old gossips. The next morning, at dawn, Karen showed up with a surveyor and a local shop owner named Dale. Dale's a tire guy. Decent enough. Shoulders hunched like a man trying to be small. They stomped around the property as if they were chasing a raccoon. Karen, barking orders. Snapping photos through my windows like privacy was a rumor. The cameras caught every second clean. Legal. Time-stamped. Later. I learned Dale was in tax trouble, and Karen's old insurance license had been pulled years back. Hypocrisy has a smell. It's like cheap perfume in a hot church. You can't quite place it at first, but it makes your eyes water. The surveyor, a kid named Jimmy with boots new enough to squeak, pulled me aside when Karen wasn't looking. She only paid half. He muttered. Said to, help the process. Make sure we find something. He looked at his boots. She threatened my license. I told him to keep his receipts. He asked for a chance to make it right. I said, sure, but do it the honest way. A week later, my cameras caught Jimmy relieving himself behind my shed. Not exactly a felony. But when Karen heard, she screeched about health code violations, like she'd uncovered a biohazard. Report away. I told her, but you might want to explain why your hired man was on my land after hours. The comedy might have been funny if she hadn't already slapped a lawsuit on me, $12,000. Give or take. And a push to shut down my dock while the court sorted things out. Her biggest mistake wasn't the paper. It was her mouth. At Murphy's Diner, 2 eggs over easy. Coffee, strong enough to stand a spoon. She told anyone who'd listen that I was a dangerous, unstable veteran. That I was a threat. That I made the neighborhood unsafe. Now, I'm a lot of things. Neighbor. But I ain't that. I called my buddy Tom, an Afghanistan vet who knows the weight of rumor. Document it. Tom said. Every word. And so I did. Every insult she floated, I pinned to the board. Every letter she slid into my mailbox, I scanned and stored. You build a record, like you build a dock, plank by plank. Straight and true. I found a lawyer, Stella Crawford. Out of Grand Rapids, sharp as lake wind in February. She listened. Eyes narrowed. Then smiled without showing teeth. Michigan has private attorney general statutes, she said. If we prove systematic fraud, we can act on behalf of everyone she's exploited. She flipped through my files. And your grandfather's place wasn't legally subject to the HOA at all. They dragged you in after the fact. I felt the ground steady under me. We'll file a counterclaim, she said. Fraudulent formation, harassment, elder exploitation, the works. I nodded and, my hands shook just a little from the kind of anger that feels like cold. At the next HOA meeting, held in a clubhouse that smells like dry carpet and stale coffee, Karen presided with a gavel she didn't need. Dale, trying to be helpful, or maybe just tired of the weight on his shoulders. Let slip that the formation paperwork was sketchy from day one. The room went silent. The vice chair stared at his shoes. Karen's smile cracked. You could hear the air conditioner think about turning on. After the meeting, people approached me one by one, like survivors picking their way out of smoke. Martha, who tended the same rose garden since the year Woodstock was a thing, told me how Karen made her dig it up because it violated the color palette. Tom admitted, even with all his deployments, he'd never been more stressed than living under Karen's clipboard. A young couple whispered about fines for their twins' chalk drawings. Chalk. Of all things. Piece by piece. The pattern showed itself. Karen targeted people who couldn't fight back or thought they couldn't. She twisted the rules into snares. Instead of backing off, she doubled down. Daily compliance checks. Anonymous complaints to the county about environmental concerns. Late-night prowls 9 o'clock. Sometimes later, when my cameras caught her crouched behind my rhododendrons like she'd misplaced dignity out there in the leaves. She called my mortgage company. Her brother-in-law worked at a branch and tried to stir trouble there. 2. My daughter, away at college, called in tears. Dad, are you okay? My ex-wife asked about legal fees. I stared at the dock and remembered my grandfather's hands scarred. Patient. Steady. I told myself this wasn't just about me. It was about the next neighbor Karen would corner. Then the money trail cracked open. HOA reserves don't just go missing like spare socks. But somehow they had. 67 grand gone. Funny thing, though a brand new company with Karen's name on the filings had been managing maintenance contracts nobody ever saw. That money paid a stack of her son's restaurant, rent, and well, there was a casino credit line that didn't look like landscaping. I laid the bank statements out on my kitchen table, beside photos of fish bones and red gloves. The fish, that was another stunt. My back camera caught Karen at 11 at night. Pink gardening gloves on, dumping a bag of rotting fish near my septic lid. In the morning, the county inspector arrived, anonymous tip, of course, and sniffed the scene with a face like a man who regrets breakfast. He squinted at the bones and seasoning. Looks like Friday fish fry. Not a leak. He glanced at Karen, whose smile turned thin enough to cut paper. Where'd you get that? Ma'am, he asked. She pretended not to hear. Somewhere in the middle of that mess, a private investigator, Danny Plust, brother to Jimmy, called me from a blocked number. She hired me to, plant things, he said. Recordings. Fabricate violations. I'm done. I kept the audio. I met him at the picnic tables by the public beach. He slid a flash drive across the wood like it was contraband. On it, Karen's voice, clear as bells. Find something or make it up, she said. You'll get a bonus if it sticks. I listened twice, then a third time, because disbelief is stubborn. Desperate people do loud things. Karen filed a police report, claiming I'd threatened her with military skills. The officer, who came out calm guy with sunburned forearms, sat at my table and watched the footage. He rubbed his jaw, said, "Keep documenting." He shook his head on the way out, like a man walking past a raccoon rummaging in daylight. Then, the local news rolled up. Channel 7. Cameras bright. Hair. Perfect, because Karen had fed them a tale. A dangerous ex-military neighbor terrorizing a sweet, civic-minded HOA. Come in, I told the reporter. Here's the file. Here's the video. Here are your timestamps. The story that aired that night wasn't the one Karen wrote in her head. They called it HOA horror, when neighbors crossed the line. My phone buzzed with texts from folks I hadn't heard from in years. The Attorney General's office called the next morning and moved our meeting up. I gathered the neighbors at dawn around thermoses and donut holes. We called ourselves the Coffee Club. Because, if you're gonna rebuild trust, you start with caffeine and truth. We made a list of everything Karen had done, a ledger of small cruelties and big ones. Martha kept minutes in a lined notebook. Tom offered to organize files. The young couple brought a box labeled Chalk Gate. It felt like building a barn. Only the boards were affidavits, and the rafters were screenshots. Then, beneath my grandfather's medals and a brittle newspaper clipping announcing his return from Korea, I found the paper that turned the ground under Karen's feet to mud the original deed from 1960. The lines on that old survey, wavy as a drunk uncle's signature, showed our property stretched a good 40 feet farther than current maps claimed. You know what sat on that strip? Karen's prim little rose gazebo. The thing she'd built for HOA socials and photo ops. Her kingdom on our land. I took a breath and closed the tin trunk like I was saying amen. The big day arrived, the way big days do, slow morning. Fast heart. The Attorney General, Mr. Santos, climbed my steps just as a silver SUV whipped into the drive. Karen barreled in. Breath tight. Tape measure out. Words slapping the air. Immediate compliance, she snapped. Or we escalate penalties. She stopped. She saw the badge. And for the first time since she'd moved here, she ran out of words. Ma'am, the Attorney General said, the way a good teacher says a name. You have entered this property without consent. Repeatedly. We have you on video planting evidence. We have audio of you instructing a contractor to fabricate violations. We have a paper trail from the association's reserves to your private company. And we have a deed that places your gazebo on Mr. Holloway's land. He slid the folded deed across my table. The paper whispering. You will wait outside. Karen's face went the color of skim milk. She tried to laugh. It came out like a cough. She mumbled something about a misunderstanding. About just doing her duty. The Attorney General lifted a hand, just a little, and the room stilled. Outside, the lake lapped the shore. Slow as breath. Inside, you could have heard cedar settle. Within the week, law enforcement swept in early enough that porch lights were still on. Karen and the developer's boy, who wasn't a boy anymore. Just a man who'd learned the wrong tricks, left in matching bracelets. Her clipboard lay in the driveway like a fallen crown. The judge dissolved the association that had been built on crooked paperwork. Ordered restitution to every neighbor fleeced by fines that never should have existed. Karen got years 5. As I recall, federal, not county. Folks say she cried at sentencing. I don't know. I was out by the dock, tightening bolts. What came next wasn't just relief. It was repair. We put Martha's roses back in the ground. Only this time, we planted them along a fence everyone agreed on. Tom organized fishing mornings for veterans. The young couple brought their twins to chalk the whole cul-de-sac bright squares and shaky letters in smiling suns. Free as summer. Dale paid off his taxes with a little fundraiser we called the Coffee Can Project. Neighbors dropping bills and coins into an old Folgers tin by the hardware store register. And my daughter came home for a long weekend. Walked the dock like she used to when she was little. And said, I'm proud of you, Dad. I had to turn my face to the wind for a second. Karen's former rose garden. We turned it into a community compost bin. Neighbors carried kitchen scraps like offerings. Martha flipped the pile with a pitchfork that could tell stories. The soil went black and rich. Her new memorial bed color, splashed like 4th of July, grew out of that compost. A thing built from rot into bloom. There's a metaphor in there somewhere. You can find it if you stand near the lilies around sunset. At night, I sit on the dock with coffee gone warm and think about bullies. They're loud until they're not. They count on silence. They count on us keeping our heads down and our mouths shut. On folks believing rules are more sacred than people. But rules without neighbors ain't community. They're just paper with sharp edges. My granddad used to say, measure twice, cut once, and never cut a man down to make yourself tall. If you ask me, the best part of all this wasn't the courtroom win. It was watching a street full of strangers become a neighborhood again. So tell me, if your HOA ever crossed the line, if a Karen with a clipboard marched right over your porch step and into your life, what would you do? What did you do? Drop your story in the comments. 'Cause you never know who's gonna read it and think, okay, I can stand up, too. I didn't tell you about the night the generator failed. Early spring. Wind rattling the windows. Pine boughs, doing that whisper hiss they do when a storm rolls off the lake. The entire neighborhood went dark. Streetlights. Porch lights. Everything but the distant blink of a radio tower. I lit a couple lanterns and checked on my elderly neighbor, Mr. Hines, a retired machinist who fixes toasters for fun. On my way back, I spotted a beam of light near my shed, small, shaky. My camera had already pinged me. The feed showed Karen prowling the side yard in a rain slicker, hood up, like a cat who forgot she hates water. Just checking for code issues. She would have said if I'd called out, but I didn't call out. I watched. She bent near the septic, then near the back spigot, then aimed her light into my truck bed like she expected to see contraband pumpkins. The next morning, she sent an email, subject line, urgent environmental concern, claiming she'd observed and detected a leak. The inspector came out wearing patience and steel-toed boots. He sniffed, "What? Listen," and finally said, "Ma'am, the only leakage I detect is last night's storm." He clapped me on the shoulder and drove off, leaving Karen in the rain with a form letter that said, "No violation noted." Stuff like that makes you laugh, or it makes you tired. Maybe both. It's the drip, drip, drip that wears down stone. And, yeah, I was getting worn. So I wrote letters. Lots of them. Not rants letters. Calm. Fact-stacked. Time-stamped. I sent them to the board, to the management company, to the bonding insurer, to the county clerk. Please advise whether the association is in compliance with state statute. I wrote, please produce minutes and financials as required by law. Paper is slow, but paper walks into rooms you can't. Every time someone tried to shrug and slide my letter into a drawer, another letter showed up. I wasn't angry on paper. I was steady. That was new for me. One afternoon, Dale stopped by with a set of old photos he'd found stacked behind a file cabinet. He looked like a man setting down a heavy bag. The photo showed a groundbreaking party folding chairs, sheet cake, a banner that read, "Lakeshore Pines welcomes you." The date stamp sat fat and red in the corner. In one picture, you could see my granddad at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, smiling like a man who knows his land and his lines. In another, the developer's son stood with a pen in his hand, And that pen, well, it looked busy. I kept my mouth shut too long. Dale said. Voice ticked with shame. I thought if I didn't look at it, it wasn't my problem. Sorry. He scratched his jaw. I'm trying to be better. I poured him coffee and slid over a cinnamon roll wrapped in wax paper. Trying counts. I told him. We looked at the pictures until the past felt less like a fog and more like a map. When Channel 7's story aired, phones lit up across the county. Martha said people she hadn't heard from since high school sent messages. That's the Martha who grew sunflowers higher than the mailbox. Tom's old squad buddies offered to write statements. A teacher from 2 streets over came by with a thumb drive full of emails, her own run-ins with Karen. All the snide footnotes and italicized threats. I didn't want to get involved, she whispered. But you, well, you made me brave a little. Courage is contagious the way laughter is. At our coffee club, we started speaking the names of things. Not just Karen is mean. But here's the statute. Here's the clause. Here's where they're out of bounds. Stella explained how fraud has a shape and a smell. How it reflects light like oil on a puddle. We're not going to holler, she said. We'll show. We'll build a case so clean a judge can see straight through it. She taught us to log calls, to print and staple, to keep originals in a binder and copies in a second place. Martha labeled tabs with neat cursive that made me think of report cards. Tom synced a cloud folder. The young couple made a spreadsheet that could make an auditor blush. Meanwhile, Karen tried charm, then threat, then the kind of apology that isn't one. She cornered me by my mailbox. Voice sweet as iced tea. Rex, we can work something out, she said. For the sake of harmony. I told her harmony without honesty is just a quiet lie. She flinched like I'd snapped a twig too close to her ear. Later, she left a note tucked under my doormat that read, comply by Friday. Or else. Or else what, I wondered. Or else the lake stops being water. I'm not proud of this part. But I'll tell you anyway. One night, after another letter from her lawyer landed on my table like a mosquito, I lost my temper. I stood on my porch and shouted at the trees. I said words I try not to say. I threw a rock into the dark and listened for a splash that didn't come. Then I sat on the steps and cried a little. A grown man crying over a clipboard that's ridiculous. Right, but it wasn't the clipboard. It was the unkindness. It was the way small power makes some folks forget we're neighbors, not enemies. The next morning, I made eggs and called my daughter. Hey kiddo, I said. You ever get so angry you feel hollow? She laughed soft. Worried. Every finals week, she said. Breathe. Dad. Drink water. Be stubborn. That's your superpower. She was right. Stubborn wins. Slow fights. When the Attorney General scheduled the meeting, I swept the porch and brewed a fresh pot like I was expecting a minister. Neighbors trickled in with manila folders and muffins. Tom set out folding chairs. Martha put a jar of daisies on the table because daisies improve any situation. Mr. Santos arrived with 2 staffers who carried clipboards in a way that didn't scare anybody. He listened. He asked careful questions. He read the deed like it was a short story. When he stood, he said, "We're going to move on this." Just like that. Not a promise. A plan. The arrests didn't heal the years overnight. But truth changes the temperature of a street. It makes people wave again. It makes you borrow a ladder without a knot in your stomach. The day after, I found a casserole on my porch, no note. Just noodles under breadcrumb snow. A week later, the church down on Old Mill Road hosted a potluck labeled Neighbors, Not Rules. Folks brought deviled eggs and stories. Someone played guitar badly. Someone else gave away seedlings in paper cups. I watched a new couple get 3 different offers of a snowblower for winter. That's a community. That's the thing Karen could never legislate. A few months later, we held a workday. We patched docks, mended fences, and painted the little park bench where teenagers carve initials in a language only they understand. I fixed the squeaky hinge on the tiny library box and found a note inside. Thank you for fighting for us. Sloppy handwriting. Might have been one of the twins. I stuck it in my pocket and carried it around for a week like a talisman. I still keep the cameras. Not out of fear, but out of habit. I still keep the binder. 2. Because memory fades and paper doesn't. But most nights I turn the porch light off and sit in the dark a while, listening to water knock the shore. I think about my grandfather and the way he measured things twice. Always twice. And about how he'd laugh at the idea that a rose gazebo could float from one property to another just because a woman said so. Land's land. Rex. He'd say, it ain't opinion. If you're in the thick of it yourself, if there's a Karen measuring your grass with righteous fury, and let me tell you what worked for me. Document. Don't rage. Record. Ask for minutes and statements and receipts they're supposed to keep anyway. Learn the statutes. Don't be mean. Be precise. And don't do it alone. Call your Martha. Call your Tom. Make coffee. Tell the truth in daylight. Bullies wither in it. What would you have done different in my shoes? Would you have kept quiet and hoped the storm blew past? Or marched into that meeting and read the deed out loud? Steady as Sunday, tell me down below. Somebody out there is scrolling for courage right now. There's one more piece I've been meaning to tell. The part where forgiveness showed up wearing work gloves. Months after the dust settled. I was stacking split wood under the eaves when a car pulled into my drive beat-up sedan. Engine knocking a rhythm you could dance to if you were the generous type. Dale stepped out, with Jimmy and Danny trailing behind. The brothers who'd been wrapped up in Karen's nonsense. They looked smaller. Not in the flesh, but in the shoulders. Rex, Danny said, hat twisting in his hands. We owe you an apology. And, the neighborhood, too. He set a toolbox on the grass. We'd like to fix what we can, Jimmy added. Free survey. The right way this time. He lifted a tripod like an offering. I could have told them to turn around. I could have thrown their worst moments back at them. Instead, I pointed to the old fence that had leaned drunk for years. It's been on my list. I said. You free this afternoon. We set posts in fresh concrete. Danny patched the spot where Karen's gardeners had scalped my lawn. Jimmy reshot the lines and handed me a map printed crisp as a new bill. Martha wandered over with lemonade. Tom hauled a wheelbarrow like it owed him money. By sunset, the fence stood straight. The kind of straight that lasts. We leaned on it, sweaty and quiet, and watched the light go gold on the water. Thank you, I said. 2 words that felt heavier than they used to. We're trying to be the men our wives think we are, Danny muttered. And we all laughed in that careful, relieved way you laugh when the pain's gone, but the bruise remains. Not every story has a villain who gets hauled off. Some end smaller, an apology, a vote, a new board run by people who bake casseroles. Some end messy settlements, grudges, long winters of polite nods. Mine ended with a clipboard on a driveway and a neighborhood turning compost into roses. If I'm honest, I still flinch when I hear the click of a tape measure, but I also smile when I hear a mower 2 houses down. Because that means somebody's still tending. Most nights. After the last loon call, and before the mosquitoes organize, I sit at the edge of the dock and let my feet dangle in the cold. I watch the cabin windows glow and the pines stitch the sky. The lake keeps its secrets, but it offers a lesson. Pressure makes ripples. Then the ripples smooth out. Takes time. Always does. Keep watching, and you'll see the surface go glass again. The world reflected so clean, it startles you. If your HOA turned into a headache bigger than a holiday fruitcake, if your Karen wields bylaws like a saber, if your board forgot that covenants were written for neighbors, not against them, come tell us what happened. What worked? What didn't? Would you call the state? Hire a lawyer? Knock on doors with muffins and meeting minutes? Anyone else had a HOA do this to you? Because here's the thing I learned the hard way. We don't fix neighborhoods with louder rules. We fix them with longer tables. With coffee and binders and daisies in a jar. With stubborn kindness and folly. Yeah. Sometimes with a courtroom and a case number. Bullies don't stand a chance against a street full of porch lights turned on at the same time. All right, your turn. What would you do here?